Hello and welcome to the first Britgrid Blender Intermediate class. Gosh, that's a mouthful. That runs at Britgrid 7:30 p.m. GMT Sundays. And right, so let's get started. You should be able to see my screen. There we go. So I'm just loading in the file that I'm going to be working on today, and as you'll notice, we're using Blender 2.82a, which is the current release version, and very nice it is too. So without further ado, let me just cover a couple of things that I tend to use whilst I'm working. So I tend to use orthographic mode, which you should be able to see is this little grid type icon in the top right hand side there, and basically that takes off the perspective view from the camera, although I have noticed that as you're using it, occasionally it will pop back into perspective mode. If you find it's doing that and you don't want it to do it, you can go to Preferences and Navigation, and you might find there's a tick up here where it says Auto Perspective. So if you find it's flicking in and out of perspective mode, then you can just untick that, save the preferences, and you should find that will solve the issue. Today I'm going to cover a question that I've been asked a few times, in so much as why, when I import mesh into OpenSim, or when I say get a mesh building or something like that from the hypergrid, why does the physics not work? Why is it all funky? Why can't I walk inside the building? Mostly that's to do with the fact it's mesh that was imported before OpenSim 0.9 whatever, because it used a different physics system, and with the U-Bode physics that comes with that version of OpenSim, you can actually import mesh and specify what's called a physics shape, which is essentially perhaps a slightly low polygon representation of the structure that the simulator uses to calculate physics. And of course, with older mesh, you didn't have to do that. It kind of made it up as it went along, and consequently it breaks when you try that mesh in OpenSim 0.9 whatever. So the trick is to specify a physics shape, but I'll show you that in a second. Another good thing about Blender 2.82a, or anything over 2.8, is it now defaults the world, what's called the world kind of scale, to be set in meters, which is very good, because obviously OpenSim we use meters as well, so that gives us an idea of scale if we're using scale. And you can see I'm using collections here on my outliner. You can see I've got various collections here, which is a very good way of separating things out visually. If you've got a complicated scene, you can toggle things on and off, makes it super easy. I like to create a little a mesh cube, almost like a cube, to represent a person, and if we look, we can see, let me put my shortcut keys on, I didn't do that. Please shout at me if I forget to do that. There we go, you should be able to see those in the bottom left hand side. Anyway, as I was saying, if we go back to where's one of these? Probably that one. Yeah, so you can see that on the scale here, on the Z, it says it's 1, which is fine. In fact, I'm not sure it is. It might be, but it's roughly the same size as a person. So that helps me when I'm creating mesh. That helps me compare that against the thing that I'm creating. So, and today what we're going to do is just cover creating a kind of simple house shape and a simple physics shape to go with that house. Just turn my little person off. So if I turn on this house, I've got a window cutter. What I've done here is I've created, let me turn that off because that's rather confusing. There we go. So I've created a quarter of a house because I'm lazy. I didn't want to create a full-size house, it's too much work, so I can just create a quarter of a house, and then those little blocks you saw earlier, I basically just used a Boolean modifier. We'll talk about the modifier stack in a minute, but modifier stack just to punch the holes in where the windows and the door was going. So that's all they do. I'll turn those back off. So yeah, getting back to modifiers, let me show you what I mean about the modifier stack. So here you can see I've got my quarter house, such as it is. I'll put it into wireframe, it makes it just a little bit easier to see. Then if we go to the modifier stack, we can say add a modifier, we can choose mirror, and we've got a few options. You can see it automatically mirrors on the x-axis, which is the kind of red coloured axis, and if we want it to also mirror in the y-axis, we can just click the Y button, and you can see that there we go, it's kind of made a whole house. There's also something called clip-in, which you can turn on. Clip-in means that at the joining point, which is effectively where the 3D cursor is, any vertices that overlap, that kind of butt up against each other. If I go into edit mode, and I might be able to show you edit mode, or maybe I won't. I was just gonna see if I can select the vertices. Right, so you can see, case in point, right where this little section is here, where the floor inside meets, each one of those quarters of the floor are going to have vertices. So of course with 4 quarters you're going to have kind of 4 vertices all butting up against each other, unless you turn on clipping, and what that does, it kind of pushes them together and makes it only be a single vertices, which is ideal for what we want. So just going back to this modifier, this mirror modifier, modifiers in Blender are, generally speaking, non-destructive. So in other words, even though that looks like a big full house here, it won't actually take effect until we press on the apply button. Then this modifier will disappear because it will have already done its job, and we will have a house that is complete. But until we do that, we've got the option of just undoing the modifier, and we've not really done anything to it. It's all done by the magic of computers. So until we apply it, it just shows us what would happen, and then after we apply it, it makes that thing happen, and we're good. And if you don't want the modifier, in this case I don't, because I've already got the house on a separate layer, then we can just delete that modifier, and we're kind of back to how we first started. We've not really done anything. I was just showing you the use of the modifier. So what I've done throughout this file is I've basically applied modifiers, scaled it a bit, added materials, all this kind of stuff, and generally I will, as I'm working on something, I will make a copy of it, and then work on the copy, just in case you get to a stage where you say apply some modifiers and it breaks what you're working on, and then oh rats, you know. Although Blender does have an undo system, but after you've applied modifiers, frequently you'll find you can't then undo it. So it's good to have a backup plan, as they say. So this house here, so basically this is just the whole house with a few, I guess I can show you the materials, very simple materials, kind of blue for the window, grey for the roof, bloody blah, you know. And in fact, I'm not sure, has someone got a floor inside it? I think it might have, yeah. Yeah, I think it's got a floor in it, but it hasn't got anything else if we look at it. So you can just see that there's a floor inside. So to test our physics import, I went to town a little bit more, so did a little bit more work on it. And as you can see, we've got a door, we've got a staircase, we've got a hole in the floor. A bit easier to see it in wireframe. If I just toggle it off. So now that mesh isn't particularly complex, it's still a relatively simple mesh, and when we import it, as I say, we can specify a file that we want to use as a physics shape. Now with some mesh you can just say, oh well, we'll use the file itself, it's a small file, you know, it'll work fine. In this case that's not necessarily true, because there's a fair amount of complexity. You don't want it working out the physics on every little thing. For example, you can see we've got some little brackets around the drain pipes with little bolts on them. We don't want it to work out the physics on that. We don't care. As long as it works out the fact that there's a pipe there, that's good enough. We don't want it to work out the physics of all the gaps between all the railings on the stairs, or it's going to bog the computer down when you try and import that as a physics shape. So with that in mind, this is our actual mesh house with its materials and such like, but I then copied that house to a different collection. Collections are awesome, by the way. You can see that this version is somewhat simplified from a point of view. If I can just stop it from being selected, you'll see that I've taken all the silly little brackets off the drain pipes. You can also see that inside, let me just make that a bit easier to see. So if we go to solid mode, and then I'm just going to get rid of, I'm just going to hide rather, just going to hide the roof so you can see what's going on inside a little bit better. So you can see that rather than having the complicated banisters and the complicated steps, I've just used the other mesh house, the one with the staircase, as a guide, and I've just made a simple kind of banister surround and a simple kind of slope, a kind of stairwell type thing. So let's show what we hid previously. And I'll just unselect that. So when we go to export, and one thing before we talk about exporting, what I would mention is it's quite important that if you scale something, for example, I scaled the house up a little bit because I wasn't too pleased about the proportion of it. It looked a little bit tiny, and things in World tend to do that. you tend to have to make them a little bit larger than they would normally be in real life, mainly because most of the avatars are like 9 foot tall or something ridiculous. So I scaled it up. When you do that, it's important to remember, once you've finished scaling it, translating it, whatever, to apply the object transformations, which should mean, once you've done that, and you'll find that under object apply, and normally you would do scale and rotation, but you can do all transforms. Once you've done that, you should find that the scale on the thing that you've applied it to should go to 111 X, Y, and Z. So let's talk a bit more. Oh, and I've got a door in there as well. I don't know if the doors are shown. It's not on that house. It's on that one. I'll talk about the door a bit later. It's really not that interesting, but you might find it vaguely interesting. So let's look at how we would export this. Bearing in mind we want to export the house, the door, and we also want to export the physics shape, or a kind of simplified physics shape. So let's start with the house first. So ordinarily you would just select the object, go to File, go to Export and choose Collada, click on the little cog at the top right hand side and choose SL OpenSim Static. You can leave most of the options as a default. I think I've put my files. I've already exported this, so you can see that I've got the house DAE and the house physics DAE and the green door, and basically you then just say export, and as long as you've got selection only, you can check the other settings if you want to, apply modifiers, blurdy blur, whatever. I mean, you can change those should you want to, but as long as you've got selected only, and export that, and that will export to whatever you name it, to house. Similarly, you need to do the same with, whoops, let's turn my little person off. Similarly, you need to do the same with the door. So you would just select the door. If you look at the door closely, you'll notice that it's got a bit of false geometry on it, an extra bit of mesh, which just sets the pivot point to the hinge of the door, which is if you're going to script it, that tends to make it swing open or closed in world a little bit more accurately, rather than having to add transparent prims as hinges and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so you basically repeat that with the door, the export. You then go to your physics shape, exactly the same again, just select it, File, Export, Collada, and choose the preferences. Right, well that's probably me done for today as far as the tutorial goes. I hope I haven't waffled on too much, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you for joining me with it today, and I hope to see you again next week. So bye for now, take care, see you next week.